Thank you.
So hopefully everybody grabbed a sheet when you came in. You've got the maps and such that I put out there. So let's begin with prayer. Dear great and gracious God, we give you thanks for this day that you've created. And as we think about the ministry of St. Paul and all that he accomplished bringing about your word to the world, we ask that you bless us to also be able to share your word with those who have never heard, so that they may know of your love for them as well. In your name we pray. Amen.
I'm sorry.
Always. All right. So I did this class yesterday, and I hate to say it, but after doing it, it gave me a chance to redo it. So I didn't really even have a PowerPoint yesterday, so now I've got a PowerPoint presentation and all the things I did there that I want to change. So you're the beneficiaries of kind of what happens after the 7:30 service. And you figure out your sermon, and 8:30 gets better. So hopefully this will be a little bit about that. But you've got the handout, and on that handout you'll notice there's two sides, something to hold on to during this class. First side is the timeline, really giving you a sense of St. Paul's journeys and his, at the bottom, his writings, the letters of St. Paul, we call them epistles. So you get the whole time frame of the work. In the middle you'll see Acts, the book of Acts, and that highlights where the various places, such as the different missionary journeys, took place if you're looking for them in Acts. So those are important to note as well. On the back side you'll see a map of those journeys, and that's kind of impressive to see, if nothing else. So what this is all based around for me is that we just did a trip. A friend of mine, Phil Nybratton, who used to be pastor over at Calvary Lutheran in Brookfield, he does trips similar to ones I've done, and in fact I'm usually copying his trips. And so he called me because he was doing this trip and really was having a hard time filling up his slots and having enough people to go on the trip to make it feasible. So he asked if we'd offer it here at St. Matthew's, and we did. We ended up having 15 of us go from St. Matthew's. Karen's one of them. She's here with us today. And Chuck, I should say, too. Yeah. Chuck and Karen. So I'm not missing anybody else, I think. But 15 of us from St. Matthew's, and then Pastor Phil had 19 people from his group. And what we did was did just a little bit of what Paul did in the places that were important in Paul's ministry. So we called it a Footsteps of Paul trip, but it was to Greece, various areas in Greece and Rome, and then a little bit into Turkey and Ephesus. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. I'd like to really emphasize, though, in this class, the importance of Paul and his ministry and what he was about. So that's really the background to all of this. But again, we didn't get to much of what Paul did. So, I mean, he really went to so many areas and other areas that were very important in this ministry, but we really didn't get to them. So, for example, Jerusalem. We didn't go to Jerusalem, but lots of places that he went to. So you've got the timeline, you've got the map, and just want to highlight those and get into it. For our trip, really, it started in Athens. That's where we flew to. By the way, we flew out on the day of the bad snowstorm, and as we were driving to O'Hare, we were getting alerts on our phone saying, your flights are all canceled. And so as we got there, this is an aside, but as we got there, they said, well, this was Monday, they said, well, probably come back on Thursday and we'll be able to find something for you. Luckily, thinking on his feet, Pastor Phil lied and said to them, we have a Greek cruise we have to be on tomorrow evening at 5. You have to get us there by then. And so then it became a 6-hour waiting period of standing at the check-in desk, just trying to find a different flight that we could all get on. We eventually got on the Swiss Air flight, and we really only ended up being 3 hours behind our schedule by the time we got there. So it worked out great. But literally, they were telling everybody else that were like screaming at them at the check-in desk. They said, "What do you want us to do? Build you another airplane?" So that's the message they were putting out to everyone else. they managed to find a plane for us, which was great. So we flew into Athens, and that became the start of our trip. Now, I want us to think about Paul and the importance of Paul in this whole class. And it starts with that Acts 1:8 text. And I always call it the bullseye text. So understanding this text is bullseye. By the way, Luke writes Acts. Many of us know that, right? Luke writes about the Acts of the Apostles. So what happened right after Jesus ascends, and the beginnings of the church. And so that's what this whole book is about in Acts. And 1:8 I call the bullseye text. But you will receive power, this is Jesus speaking, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, that's the center of the bullseye, and then in all of Judea, that becomes the next ring of the bullseye, and then all of Samaria, that's the larger ring, and then all the way to the ends of the earth. So if you see it as a bullseye going out, so you could, if he was speaking to us here at St. Matthew's, he'd be saying, you'll be my witnesses in Wauwatosa, and in Milwaukee, and in Wisconsin, and into the United States, and then to the ends of the earth. So he's really creating that you're going out. That's what you're going to do. And really the message begins with Jesus, obviously. It's the good news of Christ. But then it starts with the Jews. Jesus was a Jew, right? That's important for us to know. And Jesus started his ministry with the Jews. Peter becomes one of the main figures, the other apostles as well, but Peter really is that rock that the church is built on, and the message to the Jews. But it really couldn't just stay there. It really had to move beyond just the Jews, especially in Israel, in that area. It had to move outside that. Otherwise, literally, we wouldn't be sitting here today. We would not have a Christian church. And so it took someone to come along, hopefully more than just someone, to really light that fire and get it moved beyond just the Jews. And so that really becomes Paul, and we call him the apostle to the Gentiles. When you look at Paul's story, his story doesn't really start until about chapter 8 in the book of Acts, and that is literally him just standing there as Stephen is stoned. As Stephen is stoned to death, Paul's the one holding the coats, and it literally just says, and a man named Saul was standing there collecting the coats and holding their coats while they were stoning to death Stephen. Right after that, it starts to get into Paul and who Paul is. Now, how many of us know the conversion story of Paul? You guys all know this story. This is an important story. Read chapter 9. It's a great story. It's kind of the story of Paul, because Paul was someone who was one of the religious elites. He was like a zealot. He was on fire to do away with the Christian church. So literally, as he's holding the coats, that's just one of the things he does. He's really bringing all the Christians in to be sentenced to death, and bringing them all in to have this happen. And so he's working fervently to get rid of the Christian movement that often is called the Way. So when you hear of, whenever it's referred to as the Way, that was kind of the early name for what it meant to be a Christian, or the Christian movement. And so Acts 9, I just had a little section. It's quite long, but it's really good. Now, as Paul was going along and approaching Damascus, so he's on the road to Damascus. I think Damascus has been in the news lately, hasn't it? All the bombings that are going on there. I think it's like 90 miles from the border of Israel, so it's very close. You can actually see it from the Golan Heights when you go up there. You can actually see down to it. Suddenly a light from heaven flashed around Saul. And by the way, I should have put his name up here in a different way. So he's referred to in two different names, Saul and Paul. So as he's moving towards Damascus to go and bring letters to have these other Christians sentenced to death, suddenly a light from heaven flashes around him on this road. He falls to the ground and hears a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he asked, who are you, Lord? The reply came, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. All right, so Jesus literally speaking to Paul, and everybody in the crowd hears that's traveling with him, hears this voice, but they don't see anything. Paul falls to the ground. He's suddenly blind. And by the way, that's why for Saul, this Amazing Grace is such a powerful song. Once I was blind, but now I see. And that's often all the people that have that experience, that blinding experience, but then they're finally seeing. And maybe it's a metaphorical blinding, that you just didn't understand, and now you suddenly have an epiphany. That's why instead of just calling it a conversion experience, it's kind of an epiphany. Because right after this, they take him to a man's house, and the guy says, wait a minute, this is the guy that's trying to have us killed. I don't want him in my house, or I don't want to have this happen. And so he gets this message that says, no, this is someone, Paul is someone I'm going to use to bring my message to the world. So go and heal him. And so he lays hands on him, says scales fall from his eyes, he can now see, and he becomes a fervent, just as strongly as he was against the Christian way, now he's on fire to tell everybody about Jesus. And you can imagine the trouble that makes, right? So everybody that thought he's our champion, send him out to get the Christians, now they're like, uh-oh, he's now a champion to do the exact opposite. And he's one of those kind of guys that really didn't have regard for his own safety. So he was, like I said, he's on fire. He was not concerned with the trouble he would get into himself. He was more concerned with getting the message out there. And so it's important for us to understand Paul, and I took a section from Acts 22. This is actually closer to the end of Acts. So the story's already been written, but here he is in Jerusalem. He's back in Jerusalem, and he's being held to go up for a trial. And so he's in trouble in this text. But I think it summarizes the importance of who Paul is and what he is about. Let me take a step back and just be clear about the name. So he's often called Saul, and he's called Paul. Now, a lot of pastors, and I'm just as guilty of this in the past, but after this trip I really learned better, they would say, kind of like Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah, Jacob becomes Israel. The name changes at a conversion experience or an epiphany. That was not how this was. He wasn't Saul before, and after the conversion experience he becomes Paul. These were just two different names. Saul was his Jewish name. So in Jewish circles, that's how he was referred to. In his Greek circles, he was referred to as Paul. So it wasn't because of the conversion experience. He gets used, those names get used. It's almost as if I was a pastor in El Salvador. My name might not be Pastor Chris anymore. They have a hard time saying that. They really can't say it in Tanzania. It becomes Chrissy. They add an E on the end of everything. Pastor Chrissy. It's like, well, I don't like that. So your name changes based on the culture. So that's important for us to know. He's Saul for the Jewish culture, Paul for the Greek culture. So I want to read this section for us because it really speaks to the importance and the depth of who he was. So he's under trial, and he's now going to speak to them. He says, brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I make before you. This is in front of the Sanhedrin. He is up for trial before the high court. He's in big trouble here. These are the people that had Jesus killed. They're the ones that often, if they see blasphemy, they just send him out and stone him to death. It doesn't take much before stoning to death happens. Okay, so it's a hair trigger, and he's in that position. Brothers and fathers, listen to the defense that I make before you. When they heard him addressing in Hebrew, so he's speaking to them in their own language, they became even more quiet to listen. Then he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus, this is in Roman territory, in Sicilia, so he is a Roman. But brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel. Now Gamaliel is an important name because he was probably considered, and still is considered, one of the greatest Jewish rabbis. So his name still gets used in different foundations, even in our own country, the Gamaliel Foundation. So there's different schools that will follow that. So that's an important name, and he literally learned from Gamaliel, not down through the tradition. He learned at the feet of Gamaliel. educated strictly according to our ancestral law, being zealous for God, just as all of you are today, paying reference to them. I persecuted this way. Notice way is capital. That's the name for Christians. I persecuted these Christians up to the point of death by binding both men and women, binding them, and putting them in prison, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. You all know, you've seen me do this. For them, I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus. I was on my way to go to Damascus, and I went there in order to bind those who were there and bring them back to Jerusalem for punishment. This continues on. I cut it out here because that references how he was a good Jew. He was literally one of the elite. He was one of the ones driving home the message and trying to snuff out Christianity. And he continues on, and he says something right before, but up to this point they listened to him, but then they started to shout, because they have heard blasphemy now. Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live. And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks, which is a sign that we're about to pick up stones, right? And tossing dust in the air. I love the imagery, right? Tossing dust. This is not like that race, the color race.
Oh, yeah.
It's not like that. It's a much more angry thing. Tossing dust in the air, the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging. By the way, flogging is something that happened to Jesus right before. It's whipping, where you put on a whipping post and they whip you, but it's not just with leather cords. They tie to the ends of the cords metal and bone and stone, and so when it comes across your back, it literally rips your flesh open. It was believed that 40 was the magic number for death. So if you went to 40, everybody believed this person's going to die right there. Okay? So often he would say up to 39. They would take it to 39. So they're taking to the point of death. So he's just about to be flogged to find out the reason for this outcry against him. So this is to pay him punishment before stoning. But when they had tied him up with thongs, Paul says to the centurion who's doing the work standing by him, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned, who hasn't gone through a trial? When the centurion heard this, he went to the tribune and said to them, what are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen. And the tribune came and asked Paul, tell me, are you a Roman citizen? And he said, yes. The tribune answered, it cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship. I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong, in the wrong tone. It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship, Paul said, but I was born a citizen. Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him. They're like, we're going to get in trouble if we do this. It's going to be our heads that are rolling because we did this to a Roman citizen. And the tribune also was afraid, for he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that they had bound him. So, what I wanted you to learn in that text, remember this is near the end of his missionary journey. So chapter 22 is getting near the end if you look on your charts. But what you need to realize is that he's a Roman citizen. And just like being an American citizen holds certain rights to it, you can say, well, I'm a citizen. At least I'm Jew. I should be given the right to innocence before proven guilty. If you're not a citizen, you don't have that right. You don't have that right. Those are certain things that we take for granted. But there's a lot of rights that are taken for granted. And Paul knew them as a Roman citizen. And that's what he's saying. I at least have the right to a trial here before you start to beat me and go after me. And they, as Jews, did not have the right to do that to any Roman citizen. So he just kind of mentions to the centurion, is it okay to do this to a Roman citizen? Well, what? I didn't know you were a Roman citizen. So that's important for us to do. So who is Paul? He's both a Jewish elite and he is a Roman citizen. And that affords him and makes him to be one of the perfect people for moving into Roman territory to proclaim who this Jesus is. So, get a sense of that. He understands who Jesus is because of the Bible and what Jesus talked about throughout Scripture. So having learned the Old Testament and learned it well from Gamaliel, he was first of all going after Jesus as a blasphemer, but when he had this epiphany, and he realized the Messianic text and all that how Scripture really pointed to Jesus being the Messiah, and now he's kind of had this epiphany moment. He gets that Jesus is the fulfillment of everything they've been waiting for. He becomes the perfect person then to take all that information, to get it all, to understand it fully, and then to turn around and not just speak to the Jews. He tries to do that often, but even more importantly, he's the perfect person to start moving into the Greek circles and the Roman circles and spreading this message far beyond the center of that bullseye that we talked about. Okay? So I want you to get that point. That's really important to understand Paul. So he's called to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. Now he's up against all sorts of things. And being this person who is zealous for bringing the message, not worried about his own safety, not worried about his own health, he is on fire to do this. So he's up against a lot of things. He's up against Judaism, even though it's really the heart of his message, the start to his message. You have a lot of really good Jews who are not giving up being a good Jew. You know, it's kind of like Lutherans. You know, if you went to a whole other city and there was no Lutheran church, would you continue to worship? You know, a good Lutheran would say, well, I'm a Lutheran. You know, there's no good churches here, so I guess I'll just worship at home on my own. You know, these good Jews are not giving up their faith. They're not giving up their traditions, all the things they've learned. To make a conversion for them, to become a different faith, to follow the way, to become a Christian, that's asking a lot. And often when he got into different cities, he started in the synagogue. He went to his people. You know, he started in the synagogue. But often, as you read through Acts, those are the very people that would say, heretic! And they'd bring him into the city center and want him tried for disturbing the peace. That was often the call. He's disturbing the peace of our city. He should be flogged. He should be jailed. He should be executed. You know, he was stoned at one point. They left him for dead, but he survived. You know, so Judaism was one of those things he was up against. Paganism, Greek gods. You know, thousands of them. You know, he's up against that whole system of religion that comes from the Greek god system. Greek philosophy. In that day and age, there were a lot of different schools of philosophy. I'm going to look at two of them in just a minute. And this becomes a challenge for him because they've wrestled with usually the question of how do you live right? That's often the question for philosophy. How do you have a good life? And how do you get there? What does a good life look like? You know, what does that mean? And how do we go after that? That was often the philosophical question. And you can get at that in lots of different ways according to different schools. And so Paul comes in, and people are already thinking about that question. And then to bring in Christianity, it's talking about a good life. God wants us to have a good life. What does that mean? And so Christianity has a new answer for him. The culture itself becomes a major barrier, especially we'll talk about in Corinth, because when he gets to places like Corinth, the culture has said anything's fine. You know, whatever you want to do, as long as it makes you feel good, it's okay. Well, that has a lot of potential for some really bad stuff, and he's coming into a culture like that and saying no, and having a big no, and not getting a lot of people that are happy about that no. You know, it's people don't just change and say, "Oh, good idea." They're like, "You're messing up the system." You know, we kind of like the yes, and now you're messing up the system. And besides it, you see the map that I've given you. The huge distance that he travels. Not to give away another slide, but it's 13,000 miles he travels without planes, without trains, without buses or coach buses, or even a good motorcycle or bike. He literally walks or takes small boats, or and a lot of this terrain in Asia, Cappadocia, Galatia, Syria is mountainous. So using mules often to get through those really mountainous areas. So imagine that 13,000 miles. And then just the physical danger that he's under constantly. Whenever he opens his mouth, literally, it's often this case of like, he's really challenging that sense of the possibility of being dead, of dying. So I've said a lot of this already here, but the map really shows us. I want us to look at this map. You'll notice that he does several loops out, bringing the message. So he starts, the first one is the black one, starting in Antioch, going to Cyprus, and Pamphylia, Lystra, and then he comes back. He gets all the way to Tarsus and then kind of reverses his route. But that's a small trip. But that small trip is probably 1,000 miles. I mean, I don't know how many of us would even be that interested in doing that, today even. But 1,000 miles of doing that. That's the first one. Purple takes us into the second one. Hopefully you can see it. I have a hard time a little bit with the colors. But traveling up through Syria, Asia, over to Macedonia, goes through Athens, starts to come back, going through the Greek Isles, and then making his way all the way back to Jerusalem. The third one, the red line you'll see, starting in Antioch, going again through Phrygia and Asia Minor, into Pergamon, and Philippi, and that whole section. And he almost does it as almost a reversal in that. And then his final journey becomes going to Rome for trial. But just so you know, there is belief, and you'll see it even on the timeline, they kind of reference this. There is a belief that he possibly went to Spain, although we have no record of it. There's no writings about it, but it's believed that he probably went to Spain. He had that in his intent, and they have that in that fourth missionary journey. So 13,000 miles becomes huge, and he was often beaten, often flogged. I think it was like 4 times he went through that flogging. Often jailed for long stretches of time, although the Roman citizenship helped with that, because again, you say, really, I'm a Roman citizen, is this right to be putting me in jail? And sometimes the answer was, yes, you've done some things wrong that we don't agree with, so you're going to jail. But the strength, the courage, the fortitude that he had to go through all that. And think about just going through one of those scourgings, how your body is destroyed. Going through walking that much. I talked to a lady just this last week who works at a furniture shop. I happened to be there, and she's on her feet all the time. One of her coworkers had one of those little Segways. Goes up to the knees, and he's zipping around the store. It's a huge store. I'm like, he is one of those. You have to walk. She goes, yeah, it's terrible on my knees. And she's like, I walk constantly. And I'm like, you should track your steps. That'd be quite impressive. But think about that, the toll it takes on your body. Just the walking, just that traveling, and the steps and the mountains, and besides the beatings, the scourgings. So he talks about his weakness. And so there's texts where he talks about his weakness, but the strength in his weakness. That it's not him that brings strength, it's God's message that really brings that strength. He wrote several of those letters from jail: Colossians, Philemon, Ephesians, Philippians. So those are important. So our trip, just to give you a sense, tie this in a little bit, we started in Athens. Now Paul was in Athens. And like I said, Paul was in lots of places that we didn't get to. So we got to a couple places. To call this the footsteps of Paul is a little bit overstating. We did not get to all the footsteps of Paul. But we got to a few places and a couple places that were important. One of those was into Athens. Now when he gets to Athens, this is a Greco-Roman culture. It's the heart of Greece. And so they have that as their backdrop. But it's Roman territory now too, and they are in charge at that time. And so that's part of this whole system. And when he gets there, what's interesting about Paul is he blends in. He tries to blend in, because a good speaker thinks about their audience. What's their audience? What does their audience understand? How do they live? What do they know? You can't talk to teens the way you talk to a saints group. They've two different cultures, you know. You need to use examples and talk in a language that they'll understand. And so he right away is thinking about that as he's in Athens. So I'll read this for you. While Paul was waiting, he's waiting for his companions to join him in Athens. He was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols. I've got one picture of them. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. The marketplace is another name for the agora. I talked about it in my sermon last week, that center heart of the community of Greece. It's right at the bottom of the Acropolis. I'll show you a picture here in a second. But that's often where the debates happened. And they went and debated each other on philosophy and what school of philosophy they were, and say, well, you're wrong. It's kind of like Lutherans and Catholics and Episcopalians all getting together and say, well, you know, communion is really consubstantiation versus, you know, transubstantiation. Well, no, you're wrong, you know. And that whole debate about things. So a group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? I love that. What is this babbler? So they're kind of already, you know, I don't know about this guy. Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. And they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. That's the only time you hear him say that he's been preaching about Jesus and the resurrection in Greece. Then they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting. So, important to know what the Areopagus is. Let me finish this. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they mean. So they're open to this new philosophy, this new way, and they want to know all about it. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So that was the culture. You know, you debated, you argued, you talked about things. So I wanted to give you the two different definitions of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. These are two of the schools of the day. Epicurean, I took this definition off of one of the places. I forget where it was. The philosophy indeed elevated pleasure and happiness as the most worthy pursuit. So pleasure and happiness as the height of what you're going for. But specifically warned against fine food, for it could lead to dissatisfaction later with other foods. You're not going to be happy with McDonald's if you're used to Bartolotta's. You know? Instead, the goal was a long-term pleasure marked by serenity and temperance, achieved through moderation rather than indulgence. So interesting that that's what the goal is for an Epicurean who follows that philosophy. Stoicism, an ancient Greek school of philosophy founded at Athens by Zeno of Citium, I'm saying it wrong. The school taught that virtue, the highest good, is based on knowledge, and that the wise live in harmony with the divine reason, also identified as fate and providence, that governs nature. Divine reason that governs nature, and are indifferent to the vicissitudes, it's easy for you to say, of fortune, and to pleasure and to pain. So two different ways of thinking about life, and how do you live life, and what's best for living. So this is the stuff that's being discussed as Paul brings the good news of Christ and the gospel. All right? And so he's brought to the Areopagus. I'm going to get to the pictures. So this is the view from the Areopagus, the rock above, looking down on Athens. So right now it's a big city. They like two colors, white and red. Let's see. Examples of the statues and that they have. This is one of the places on the Acropolis. This is one of the temples. I forget the name of the temple. Matt's got a better memory than I do. Parthenon there, this is being rebuilt. It's obviously the culmination of the Acropolis, the crowning jewel. This is a view, this is that marketplace I talked about, the agora, that often the discussions took place. Last week I talked about the center point with that capital that was in the center. But you're looking up at the Acropolis, that rock that literally all of Athens looks up to. So everybody most everyone in Athens is looking up at that major rock. It's hard to tell how it's a rock there because of the shadows and the lighting. Over here is the Areopagus. They also call it Mars Hill. That's where Mars was tried. The Greek god Mars was tried, supposedly. But you're looking up at that. And this is that rock. This is the Areopagus, Mars Hill, looking down on it from the Acropolis. Okay? So it's the place that trials often happened. So this is the place that often people were sentenced to death. They were brought before a trial. This was a very serious place. But it was also a place that discussions happened, that if you wanted to learn about something, this was a place where you went. But it was often almost like a court, holding court on something. So a very serious place, this Mars Hill. This is right from Mars Hill, looking back up at the Acropolis. So it's a rock. It's not a real friendly rock. And it's because it's been worn over centuries, it's slippery. Trying to get there, I lost my footing once, so it's kind of rough. There's our group, and this is the sermon I'm going to read for you in a second, and that's me in the back. So I want to prove I was there, just so you know.
Well, who's taking pictures there if you're in it?
I know, that was the real trick. So, let me go back to the sermon. So he gives this sermon on that rock to the people that want to hear about this new philosophy, this new religion he's bringing. And this is a famous sermon. So Paul stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see," now remember, he's speaking their language. He's trying to use their vernacular. "I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around," he's giving them a compliment. I love the compliment. "You're very religious. For I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar." This is his way in. This is his sneaky way in. "I even found an altar with an inscription." So all these altars have to the Greek god Dionysus, the Greek god Mars, all the Greek gods. "But I found one to an unknown god." This is his way in. That's what people love about this whole sermon. Gets his way in. You'll notice, why do they have an inscription to the unknown God? Because they've got thousands of gods that they lift up. Well, it's because they don't want to be in trouble when a god shows up and says, "How come I don't have one?" "Oh, well, that's what this one is. It's the one without an inscription. We just didn't get your name on it." So it's kind of like the trophy at the soccer game for the kid that didn't get one. "Oh, yeah, no, here it is. We just didn't get your name on it. Sorry about that." So they have this whole inscription to an unknown God. It becomes Paul's way of saying, "Let me tell you about that unknown God that you don't know about. So you are ignorant," maybe use a different word, "ignorant of the very thing you worship. And this is what I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples, but by human hands, built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. From one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their lands." God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. This is one of my favorite passages. "For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own prophets have said, we are his offspring." I love that text. "Therefore, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day that he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed." He doesn't name the man. He doesn't name Jesus here. The man he has appointed. "He has given proof to this to everyone," and this is where Paul gets in trouble, "by raising him from the dead." So using that phrase, now he's touched on another philosophy. Now he's touched on a major point in a different philosophy. And everybody, when they hear him say, raising from the dead, all go, oh, you're one of those. You're one of those schools that we've already said we don't agree with, right? So when he touches on that, it's like the lights go off. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, oh, we want to hear you again on the subject, and they leave. We'll hear you again. Thank you for your words. Goodbye. So it's kind of a polite leaving, but others are already sneering. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people became followers. So realize that right as soon as he says that, everything's done, and everybody just gets up and leaves. And theologians look at this and go, wow, it's kind of like you're in the middle of a sermon and the whole congregation goes, well, we don't believe him anymore, let's go. And everybody leaves. So there's that whole point that happens here. At that, Paul left the council. Some of the people, though, became followers of Paul and believed. Among them was Dionysius, a member of the Areopagus, also a woman named Damaris, and a number of others. So a few people start to follow Paul in Athens. But this major sermon really doesn't get received real well. But the amazing thing is, we still lift it up. It's still an important sermon for us. The sermon to the unknown God, telling about who the unknown God is, that in him we live and move and have our being. I love that phrase. So, that's Athens. I already showed you some of the pictures. I've got other pictures I want to get to. We're still doing okay. And there's that sermon. It's now literally mounted. It's mounted on Mars Hill, on the Areopagus. If you ever thought after everybody just left that he'd actually have those words mounted there, I'm sure you'd be like, I don't believe that. Not after how well it went today. So anyway, that is Athens, and Paul has some ministry in Athens, but that's one of the major highlights that comes up in Acts. From that, we went from Athens over to the other red dot there, Corinth. One thing I want to point out about Corinth, it's all part of the Peloponnese. So that's a section of Greece that's kind of almost like this appendage sticking off on the side. I don't have a wider view of Greece. But you have to go out this little landmass, and they've actually, right here, I think it's right here, it might be right here. They've cut, no, I think it's up here. They've cut a canal, and it's a small canal. It meant more to them in the past because their boats actually fit through it. Now their boats don't really fit through it anymore. So small little yachts can go through it, but the cruise ships cannot. So it doesn't really help the cruise ships out and that kind of thing. But there is a canal. I'll show you in a minute. There's a canal, so you get a sense of that. They want to widen it, but they would be shutting off like all of the Peloponnese to receiving goods and services, and so it's a struggle. So anyway, Paul goes to Corinth. After he left Paul left Athens, went to Corinth. There he met a Jew named Achaia, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy, and his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had orders all Jews to leave Rome. So Claudius, the ruler in Rome, had ordered all the Jews to leave. Paul went to see them, and because he was a tent maker, as they were, this is one of the things Paul did as a way of making money. He made tents. So they often refer to him as a tent maker. He wasn't making money as a pastor. He was literally making them as a tent maker. He stayed and worked with them. Every Sabbath, he reasoned in the synagogue, trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy came from Macedonia, Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. But when they opposed Paul and became abusive, he shook off his clothes in protest. And shake the dust off your clothes and walk away in protest, said to them, your blood be on your own heads. I am innocent of it. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles. Right? That's that message, going to the Gentiles. Then Paul left the synagogue and went next door to the house of Titus Justus, a worshiper of God. Crispus, the synagogue leader, and the entire household believed in the Lord. And many of the Corinthians who heard Paul believed and were baptized. One night, the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent, for I am with you, and no one is going to attack you or harm you, because I have many people in the city. So Paul stayed in Corinth for 1.5 years, teaching them the word of God. I think I'm going to stop there to keep us moving. So he stays in Corinth for a while, but really, here's a view of near the area of the main city. So they're near, like I showed you, the major inlet there, right up where the red dot is. So they are a port city. This is some of the olden structures. There I am again. I'm in another picture, so I'm proving I'm there. This is near the end. He gets tried at this very location. It's called the Bema seat, the seat of where justice happens. And so this whole structure was where the trial often took place. And in Scripture, it sometimes talks about the Bema seat. Here's our group. This is all of us that went and in the area of the olden city of that day. So that's Corinth, and Paul's time in Corinth. Really, Acts talks a little bit about the areas, but the things that are most important to us from Paul are his letters. So because he was in other areas sending letters back to these churches, these cities that he was active in, those letters become formative for us. So his sermons continue on. You could say, well, he gave a sermon, that was it for that group of people. But really, his letters become the things that become continual sermons for all of us. And so, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, how many of us have used it at our wedding? 1 Corinthians 13, The greatest of these is love. His words continue to ring and continue to proclaim because of that we still have them. They become really crucial for us. So, in our travels, we came back to Athens, we were in Athens about 3 days, I think it was. Then we went through the Greek Isles. I'm going to skip the Greek Isles, but we did a cruise going from Piraeus here, went down, up and around through the Greek Isles. I think we kind of did it that way. Anyway, one of the major spots we got to was Kusadesi, which is Ephesus, another name for Ephesus. And that's one of the places Paul spent time in for the letter of the Ephesians, which is really important. One of the interesting things that happens to Paul is he denounces one of their Greek gods, Demetrius. No, that's wrong. Artemis. And one of the famous things in the area of Ephesus is the building of these little statues made out of silver to Artemis. And this is a picture of one of them. This is an ancient one. And so these were really popular. Everybody would buy these things. Well, Paul comes along and talks about how terrible they are and how, I've got a new way, and the whole trade falls off. So you can imagine the people that this is where they made their money weren't happy. And so this whole text talks about this silversmith named Demetrius who made silver shrines of Artemis. He gets really upset, brings Paul in, and this guy is causing trouble in our city. And again, he's up on trial, and he literally stirs the whole city up. And we are in. So this whole phrase here. Oops, darn. PowerPoint doesn't work that way. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. So he gets everybody shouting, Green Bay is great, Green Bay is great. It's that kind of thing. The whole mob is following along. So Paul was about to speak to the group in this large stadium, but the chant goes out, and great is Artemis, and we are, and so it just becomes, time to leave. And so he essentially gets out. But because he didn't speak to them, we have his letters. And again, his letters continue to proclaim. And if he had been killed that day, by the mob, we wouldn't have it. So this is some pictures from Ephesus and some of the ruins that are there. It's this major, I want to say road, but that's the wrong word for this, pathway, and that's wrong too. A wonderful, you walk down through all of these incredible statues. This is our group going down. And even along the way, you see all these mosaic tiles, beautifully decorated this whole area. You end at this kind of, one of wonders of the world, the library. It's called the library in Ephesus. That's still standing. It's just beautiful. And of course, you get a picture in front of it. I was in that one too. I'm in the back right. There I am. So there's our group. And then as soon as you pass that, there's another long passageway. So you can get a sense of the city here. You can get a sense of people moving around. There's a cat. But it ends down here at this major amphitheater. I forget how many they said they could hold in that. It was a large number. There's Nancy. And again, then after that, it leads down to the port. So this is another port city that, and we got a picture out front. There I am again. I'm in a couple pictures. So that was Ephesus, and that was really important. Of course, when you're in Ephesus, you have to go look at the Persian rugs. So we had to go see that. They drag you into the Persian rug dealership. Really funny story about the Persian rugs. You're all in there around these $10,000 rugs, and they hand you red wine. And I'm going, I don't know. And I've got this big backpack on, and I'm thinking, I'm going to spill this red wine on a $10,000 rug. And I said, what happens if we spill it? He said, well, you bought yourself a rug. I'm like, and that's why you're handing us all red wine. I was like, this is a bad idea. Anyway, we went back after that. We also did stop in Patmos, where the Revelation of John is. Really, there's not a lot to see there. You kind of see a cave where John supposedly received the revelation, then writes the last book of the Bible, Revelations. They also have a beautiful monastery there. But that was Patmos, the island of Patmos. Went back to Athens, spent a little bit of time there, and then went to Rome. Really, besides one of the greatest books of the Bible, the Romans, Paul's letter to the Romans, which is really one of the greatest theological treasures we have. So reading Romans really becomes something that is central, especially to us as Lutherans and as Christians. His writing is crucial. What he did there and what we have in Acts, in terms of like going to this spot or that spot as following his footsteps, there's not a lot in that regard, going to spots. So you go, first of all, to the Mamertine prison, which is where both he and Peter were held. It's literally a dungeon, a dark dungeon where they actually open up a hole, drop you in to the dungeon, and then cover it back up so you live in this dungeon until you're ready to be executed. So we went to that prison. I'll show you pictures. This is the dungeon. There is no bathroom there, so it's a cesspool. These are some of the pictures of Paul and Peter. They're considered some of the most authentic pictures because they're some of the oldest and probably closest to who they were. You can't quite see the hole there that they drop you in. This is above the dungeon, but Larry's standing pretty close to the hole. And they've got altars there.
Did you say it's near Nero's Circus?
So it is right at the end of the Roman Forum.
Okay.
So if you go just past the Roman Forum, they now have a church over the top of it, of course. But that's where it was, right at the end of the Forum. If you get a sense of it. Yeah.
One of the things that I think is amazing that you're saying is that when Paul did these sermons, he always spoke to the people in their own language. How many languages did he speak?
And by language, I'm talking about like the way they spoke. So he spoke Hebrew and Greek. I'm not sure if he spoke more than that. But being a Roman citizen, speaking Greek, both of those afforded him a lot of connections. But really what I was really trying to emphasize was how they heard. What kind of words did they actually use? How did they form their words? And he was able to kind of move in. And just like you talk to teenagers, and I try to talk in a little different way than I would talk to a different group. That was what I was really trying to emphasize. And he tried to think about his audience. What do they need? How can I state the gospel in a way that's going to make sense to them? So that's really the point I was trying to make there. This is the name of the prison. So that's one place we went. Another place we went was where he was executed. And that's called the Abbey of the Three Fountains. The interesting thing about the Abbey of the Three Fountains is it's the place he was beheaded, believed to be beheaded. It's outside the city walls. That was the idea. And they, after centuries, tried to find it, and they think this is the location. But the idea was Why the three fountains? The story goes, when his head was cut off, it hit the ground in three places. It bounced in three places. And at each of those three places, a spring came up. And so the three fountains. The interesting thing about it is it's now a large church. And the fountains are there, and there, and there. So I'm like, yeah. So did the springs readjust themselves into a much better form? I don't know. But this is the church. It's beautiful. It was a beautiful sight. I mean, it was just being there was very peaceful. I love foliage. It kind of had that feel, just beautiful. But inside, the beheading pictures. So here's the put on a pedestal, put his head, and then cutting his head off. This is the pedestal, supposedly. And then they had little head pictures around, so it's kind of bizarre, But, and here's a picture of the beheading, so his head's laying on the ground. So obviously terrible stuff, but this location and the nuns that are there. So there's our group. But it was a very tranquil and peaceful place to be, and that was very nice. So just quickly, other things that we saw. Like I said, I tried to emphasize more Paul in this class, but we went to Patmos, I mentioned that. Also in Ephesus, there's a monastery up in Patmos. In Ephesus, we also went to a place that's considered, in legend, the place where Mary didn't end her life, that's the wrong way to phrase it, where she spent her last days. So supposedly the last 8 years of her life. When Jesus dies on the cross, he says to John, this is now your mother, Mary, and Mary, this is now your son. So he unites them. I don't know why Jesus' brothers couldn't do the job, but now John is to take care of Mary. Okay, and so Mary, and it says in Scripture then, from that point on, Mary lives with John and is taken into his house. So John makes his way to Patmos, so the idea is that she's going with him. And the belief is that near Ephesus, there's an abbey for the Mother Mary, the place where she lived her last 8 years. There's not a lot of proof to it, but that's the idea. And there's springs that came up from the ground, and those are very special places. So we went there, and that's a beautiful place too. But one of the locations we went to. In the Greek Isles, we went to some of the different cities, different islands. Mykonos, Santorini, went to Oia, which is our St. Matthew's group went there because I wanted the pictures. It's one of the beautiful spots that they always use for Greek pictures. Went to Crete, also a beautiful island where the Minoans, that predate Greek culture. They were the first major culture. The Minotaur starts from the Minoan mythology, and then to the castle where some of us went to the castle. And then in Rome, we did a Vatican trip. Got to actually walked side by side with Colin Kaepernick. Didn't know it was Colin Kaepernick as we were walking next to him, but I'm like, this guy's big. He's big, he's muscular. He's got a whole bunch of guys with really expensive cameras. That's how I judge a lot of people. They got good cameras, This guy's special. I said, who is this guy? And they're like, it's Colin Kaepernick. I'm like, oh, thank you. So, went to Trevi Fountain, Parthenon, the Roman Forum, Colosseum, Statues, and here's some of the pictures. This is Mykonos, beautiful city, and the windmills on Mykonos. We got our final gyros there. Funny story about gyros. I was in Athens, and we hadn't had a really good gyro yet, and I'm like, I really want a good gyro. And a bunch of us were like, yeah, we haven't had them. So I said to a guy I'm talking to, we're getting gelato from a guy, and I'm like, where do you go to get good gyros? He goes, oh yeah, you don't want to come around here. They're way too expensive here. You got to go outside the Plaka, which is the main tourist area. Go outside the Plaka. They got better gyros out there. That's where you want to go. And he gave me a name of a place. So that night, a whole bunch of people from St. Matthew's like, we're going for gyros. Let's go. And as we get the taxi, I'm showing the guy. He's like, you want to go there, huh? All right. So we get in the cabs. We're all excited to get our gyros. We get out, and it's a money exchange place. And we're like, why did you bring us to a money exchange place? Because I was asking for euros. Right. Oh. I didn't figure it out for like 2 hours. I'm like, oh. He thought I was asking for money exchange.
What a wild goose.
So we finally did get some good euros on Mykonos, this little hole in the wall that 50 people were lined up to go inside. It was pretty great. This is Oya. Some of those places that, are just gorgeous, and there's a million picture opportunities. I wanted to stay.
And that's on Santorini?
This is on
Yeah.
Santorini. Santorini has 2 major cities. They bring you into one city, Fira, but you have to get over to the other side of the island to Oya.
And the legend was its big semicircle was that.
It's like a horseshoe.
Oh, yeah, Atlantis, and that's where it exploded, the
Right.
volcanic
It's
explosion,
a,
and it just filled in with
It's
water.
a crater. Yeah. So beautiful spots. This is in Rome. The Colosseum is best by night, I think. But we went in. We had special passes. They got us down onto the floor. So we're standing on the floor where the gladiators would have competed. Behind us, you'll see down in, underneath that floor. So we were standing in the very back section. But down underneath is where they kept the animals, the tigers, where they kept prisoners before the whole competition. We learned something interesting, that often they drugged the animals to make it easier for the gladiators. So they'd get them drunk, so that they, that was one of the thoughts on the whole thing. But you kind of see down in the Colosseum based on that. This is the Ark of Constantine, I believe it is, and beautiful, right next to the Roman Colosseum. This goes into the Forum, so this whole long area where a lot of stuff took place. I won't go into all of it, but the Mamertine prison that we talked about at the end of the Forum is essentially up here, right behind that building. So seeing that, this is the Spanish Steps, beautiful Spanish Steps. The view from the top of the Spanish Steps, you can go up higher. This is the Pantheon. What's amazing about this building is it's perfectly architecturally complete. It is mathematically perfect. And to think they did this way before even modern building techniques, hundreds of centuries BC, is pretty amazing. And Trevi Fountain is one of the famous fountains, and we were surrounded by tourists looking at Trevi Fountain. And here's a look at the tourists that we were in the middle of. I always like to turn backwards and then get everybody's picture, just to get a proof of what we were standing in. But I'll end with that. So that was some of our spots that we also went to that weren't so Paul-ish. So I'd probably say like a third of the trip was focused more on Paul, and then lots of others like the Acropolis and the Colosseum and such. So, questions?
Quiz question.
Yeah.
What was the last straw for Paul? What led to his beheading?
Well, he was taken to Rome for his trial. He was actually under house arrest for I think it was 2 years. What was the final straw was that he was against the state. It was illegal to be a Christian in Rome. So the Romans were executing a lot of Christians. It wasn't until 313 under Constantine that it became legal to be a Christian. So for 313 years, well, it wasn't quite 313. Christ died in 26. So anyway, it was illegal and were killed. So you actually had to hide that you were a Christian. That's what the fish symbol's about. They'd often push that fish symbol on doorposts to say we're having worship here. And they wouldn't call themselves Christians, but the way, things like that.
It comes from the Greek, and
Right,
it's an
ichthus.
anagram which spells out the word fish.
Yeah,
So they made it into the...
God and Son saving. Anyway, so it was illegal, is part of it. The interesting story about 313 was Constantine has a dream, and it's to put the Cairo, the piece of Christ sign, on their shields. And he has this dream. If you put the piece of Christ sign on your shields tomorrow in battle, you'll be successful. So he wakes up, he says, everybody's putting the Cairo on their shields. And they makes everybody put the piece of Christ sign on their shields, and they're successful. And he's like, we're all Christians now. And it becomes anti-Christian overnight, and he's like, we're all going to be Christians now. And so that whole thing.
Yeah, if you read a book, and Don Rolfs gave me a copy of the book, it's called The Faith, and it talks about from the crucifixion, Christianity to today, and some of the things they did to Christians were absolutely unthinkable.
Yeah,
they would
burnings.
roast them.
Yeah.
A number of them were sent to salt mines to
Right.
work until they died.
Right.
And it was, you know, and
You're
what
really
the
putting
Romans
your life
couldn't
in
figure
on the
out is
line.
the more they did this, the more Christians, they said there's something wrong with these people. They see what we're doing to others, but yet they're converting to Christianity.
Right, yeah.
But
So-
that was the way their faith was. It was so strong.
Exactly. So it gives you a little glimpse on Paul. Like I said this yesterday to the group. I'm like, this topic, this person is so big. We're just scratching the surface. This is just scratching the surface as to who Paul is. I mean, his writings, his theology is so deep, so profound. It's crucial. I can't overstate enough what he did for Christianity. If it had only stayed in Jerusalem and that circle of people that were speaking to Jews, it would not have really gone where it went. Because of people like Paul, especially Paul, coming and bringing it 13,000 miles at his own peril, constantly. Because of that, really, we have the church. And so, we talk about Peter as the rock of the church, but Paul was really that apostle to the Gentiles that needed to bring the message beyond. So, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
I have to start worship here in 5 minutes.
Whoa.